The Ancient Kingdoms of Peru by Nigel Davies. Chapter 8, The Boundless Realm. A diverse pattern. In recent years, surviving traces of the Inca presence throughout the length and breadth of the empire have been the subject of intense study by archaeologists. Their research reveals a complex infrastructure and suggests a pattern of firm control. Hence, the reader might assume that this great domain, stretching from north of the equator to a latitude of 35 degrees south, was basically homogeneous. But in reality, the empire was no monolithic entity, subject to a uniform system of government. Faced with marked variations between different regions, the Inca power structure displayed a notable ability to adapt itself to diverse conditions. Variable factors included the ecology of a given terrain, the culture of its people, and the length of time since it was first conquered. Only in the very broadest terms was the ecological pattern of the empire fairly uniform. Throughout most of its extent, the coast was desert or semi-desert, while the hinterland rose steeply to the altiplano, surmounted by the now snow-capped Andes, before descending more gradually on the eastern side into tropical and subtropical plains on the far side of the Cordillera. At an altitude of about 1,500 meters, the hot and damp environment tended to serve as a barrier to further Inca penetration of the interior. Accordingly, before describing the basic features of Inca rule and its effect upon subject peoples, a few comments on the varying culture and ecology of the principal regions may be useful. The core region. The Inca themselves were natives of the Sierra. The very heartland of their realm lay in the central highlands of present-day Peru. In the last centuries prior to the rise of Cusco, this extensive region had been split into a number of warlike fiefs, often accompanying a single valley, where the larger chiefdoms constantly sought to dominate their smaller neighbors. Once conquered by the Incas, these fiefs were placed under the control of a series of planned administrative centers. The Highlands of Ecuador were in many respects a northerly projection of this homeland. As we have seen, the principal city, Cochabamba, almost ranked as a second Cusco. Some confusion over Inca rule in Ecuador may arise because many Spanish chroniclers overstressed the importance of Quito, which became the Spanish capital. However, an early eyewitness, Cieza de Leon, who passed through the region in 1548, says little of Quito, but writes of the sumptuous palaces in the vicinity of Cochabamba, of which he saw ruins. He describes the Temple of the Sun as built with huge blocks of stone, reminiscent of the more grandiose Inca buildings in Cusco and elsewhere. He tells of Inca palaces with straw roofs, but which contain the finest stone sculpture and many gold objects. Numerous goldsmiths were employed in Cochabamba, and Cieza mentions large stores formerly filled with quantities of fine woolen textiles, woven by the 200 virgins housed in the Sun Temple. He writes of the Cañaris, the inhabitants of the Cochabamba region, and mentions their long hair, a custom that survives among the people who occupied the verdant countryside that surrounds the present-day city, now called Cuenca. Quito, in contrast, was probably noted in Inca times more for its strategic location and for its use as a commercial center. As Frank Solomon points out, the scarce body of testimony about Inca Quito is only slightly enriched by recent archaeological research, which has done little to increase our limited knowledge of the Inca buildings in Quito. The remains of military architecture in the former forts around the city are more striking than any faint traces of ceremonial buildings. A leading center in highland Peru, but by no means the largest, was Cajamarca, where the last Inca, Atahualpa, was captured by the Spaniards. The plaza, which they described as larger than any in Spain, was surrounded by a high wall and entered by two doorways. Little is left of its late pre-Hispanic ruins, and archaeologists have unearthed only one Inca structure. Whereas such places as Cajamarca and Chanchan had thrived before the Inca conquest, in other inland valleys the Inca would construct centers that served imperial personnel on a rotating basis. Such places in one way or another mirrored certain facets of Cusco itself. They invariably included such typical features as a plaza, a principal palace, and a temple of the sun. Typical of such sites is Incahuasi, situated 28 kilometers inland from the coast of the Rio Cañete Valley near Lima. As we shall later see, the Inca also used certain existing sites in the coastal region as administrative centers. Incahuasi was excavated in recent years by John Hislop, who suggests that Cusco's formal layout was at least partly present, including the integration of some of its more important astronomical sightlines into the city's plan. Huánuco, some 500 kilometers northwest of Cusco, is the best preserved of the large Inca provincial centers and has been intensively studied in recent years by a team headed by Craig Morris. Located some 3,700 meters above sea level in Huánuco, a greater number of the original buildings were preserved because it was abandoned after the conquest, and attempts to build a Spanish city on the Inca site bore few results. It is mostly constructed of rough stone, and only the most important structures display fine masonry. A complete map of the city was made, which includes 4,000 streets. Of these, an extensive sample was excavated as representative of the town as a whole. Not only residential districts, but large storage areas abound, clearly a major feature of such principal centers. Of these, more than 100 have been excavated. They contain about 38,000 cubic meters of storage space, much of which was used for food. Their significance is borne out by Ortiz de Zúñiga, who made an official visit in 1562 to Huánuco. His report describes the continued delivery of ample supplies of food to this city in early Spanish times. Huánuco was apparently built fairly quickly to serve as an administrative center. Many of its inhabitants came from other places and worked there as part of their mita service, a form of tax imposed by the Incas and discussed in more detail below. Like many Inca centers, it has no defensive military works and no walls. In many such instances, the Incas apparently relied less on military occupation than on the prompt transfer of a large and reliable mitime groups who served to control newly conquered peoples. In recent years, archaeologists have paid increasing attention to the manner in which people live today in such climatic conditions. For instance, Ann Kendall has investigated country dwellings in the Valley of Cusco, a form of research which helps us to understand how people survive so well in a rather inclement environment. Incidentally, guinea pigs native to Peru are still reared today in many houses, at altitudes where for much of the year a tropical heat prevails during the day, whereas, say, dried ducks or even potatoes freeze at night. Storage becomes a key technique. The magic of Machu Picchu. In writing of surviving vestiges of Inca imperial architecture, the most striking, but by no means the largest, is Machu Picchu, now one of the leading tourist attractions in all of Latin America. It is impressive both for the sheer beauty of the site and for the perfect integration of architecture and environment. On arriving on the little train, one is almost surprised to learn that Machu Picchu lies at a lower altitude than Cusco, a fact which accounts for its more lush vegetation. This awe-inspiring site was discovered by an American, Hiram Bingham, who was searching for the main stronghold of the rebel Inca Emperor Manco. He set out in July of 1911 with two companions for the territory adjacent to the Rio Urubamba. After crossing the river, he came suddenly upon a breathtaking sight, a magnificent flight of stone terraces rising up the steep hillside. Climbing as far as he could through an apparently virgin forest, he discovered building after building buried in the thick undergrowth. To quote Bingham, "I suddenly found myself in a maze of beautiful granite houses." Bingham, some years after his discovery of Machu Picchu, explored the hills above the Rio Urubamba, where he found a whole series of Inca sites along what is known as the Inca Trail, inventing appropriate names for those that had no local appellation. These places were cleared in the 1940s in expeditions that also uncovered yet more sites, including Cusicacha, or Cusichaca rather, later studied and restored by Ann Kendall. Her team even rebuilt certain Inca irrigation channels for use by local farmers. A visitor to Machu Picchu may be well advised to first climb up to the top part, known as the Upper Cemetery, which is flanked by two defensive walls. This vantage point offers a good view of the group of fine buildings of the inner city, divided by central squares somewhat reminiscent of the plan of Cusco itself. At the end of the upper cemetery stands a small construction known as the Watchman's Hut. The steeply sloping roof has now been restored. For visitors such as myself, it provided a happy refuge from a shower of rain. The inner city itself consists of finely constructed buildings that give the impression of serving as a kind of sacred sector. Stairs at the end of this group lead down to the famous Torreon or Bastion, whose curved wall, a rare feature in Inca architecture, somewhat recalls the curved walls of the Sun Temple of Coricancha in Cusco. However famous for its stonework, Machu Picchu lacks the dimensions of a true city. Its 200 buildings allowed for a population of about 1,000 inhabitants. Originally described as a fortress, the massive literature on the site now offers many alternatives as to its possible use, which remains a mystery. A constellation of even smaller sites was found in its vicinity. Huayna, for example, consists of a group of 20 chambers, a series of baths on the hillside, a circular tower, and many terraces. This chain of settlements on the Rio Urubamba, the presence of elaborate terraces and of sacred architecture suggests a significance that was both ceremonial and agricultural rather than military. Coastal Peru. The thriving principalities of the south coast of Peru, lying to the west and southwest of Cusco, were among the earlier objectives of Inca expansion. In the southernmost valleys of Ica and Nazca, the invaders met with little opposition, but further to the northwest, others resisted fiercely. Typical of the latter was Chincha, among the most important principalities of the southern coast. The conquered Chincha capital became an Inca provincial center, complete with its temple to the sun. Minimays from other places were settled in the vicinity. The Chincha ruler was accorded a status of high prestige in the imperial hierarchy, and as conqueror Francisco Pizarro's first encounter with Atahualpa in Cajamarca, this prince was the only other dignitary reported to be born in a litter. Further to the north, in the central sector of the Peruvian coast, two principalities were predominant: Ichma, which included the valley of Lima, and Colique, to the north of present-day Lima. The surviving sites of Cajamarquilla and Pachacamac were both then situated in Ichma. The latter had become a major city in the Huari era, and its population probably began to decline before the end of this period. However, Pachacamac retained its prestige as a shrine. Famed for its sanctity, it attracted pilgrims from places far distant. The captive Atahualpa's account of the store of golden treasure owned by its idol enthralled Pizarro. An early Spanish visitor was Francisco de Chedes, who accompanied Hernando Pizarro, Francisco's brother, on a visit to Pachacamac, whose ruins can still be visited today and are reasonably accessible from Lima. The purpose of Hernando Pizarro was to search for the massive amount of gold stored at the shrine. The expedition consisted of 20 horsemen, and Chedes gives a fascinating account of a perhaps typical journey by groups of Spaniards who foraged for gold in the early days after their arrival. They set out from Cajamarca on January 5th, 1533, and traveled down the great road that led to Cusco. After nearly 2 weeks, including periods of rest, they branched off the main highway at Marcara, and a few days later reached Pachacamac. The local cacique initially produced only modest quantities of bullion and declared that he had no more. The captain, as Chedes calls Hernando Pizarro, said that he would be interested to see the famous idol that served as an oracle. The idol was so hollow that people came to consult it from distances of up to 300 leagues, bringing lavish gifts of gold and silver. In addition, it received much precious metal from the people of the surrounding region. The priests were stunned by the admission of the captain to the idol's presence and feared that they would all die as a punishment for this desecration. The quest for gold was ultimately satisfied because Chedes relates that many caciques from nearby centers, including the important lord of Chincha, came to Pachacamac and brought lavish gifts that were added to the booty taken by the Spanish themselves from the Sun Temple, situated near the oracle. On the northern part of the Peruvian coast lay the great kingdom of Timor, described in some detail in Chapter 5. At the time of its conquest by Tupac Inca, it was in no respect a moribund realm, already set on the road to ruin. On the contrary, it was still actively extending its bounds at a time when Inca expansion was gaining momentum. In marked contrast to copious data on Timor provided by modern archaeological research, the traditional sources' reports of the Inca conquest are both cursory and contradictory and do scant justice to what must have been one of the most dazzling, if not the most daunting, chapters in the annals of Inca warfare. Certain reports that Timor yielded without a struggle tend to lack credibility. All accounts concur that the ruler was carried off to Cusco, and it is surely open to doubt that such a potent monarch would submit to a degrading fate and surrender his imposing capital without a fight. Timor was mercilessly looted by the Incas, and some of the gold sent to Cusco was used to make a great band of precious metal extended round the wall of the Temple of the Sun in Coricancha. The vanquished ruler was kept secluded in Cusco. A son mounted his throne as an Inca puppet, succeeded in turn by his son and grandson, though any pretense of power still exercised by such phantom rulers was methodically eroded. Timor was conspicuous for its organization and culture, though we still know too little of its government to be sure just what aspects the Incas might have borrowed. The paucity of Inca-style buildings or artifacts located in this region bears witness to a certain respect for Chimu norms, and to a consequent reluctance to impose their own culture. By archaeological evidence alone, it would be hard to establish an Inca period in the area, in contrast to the great constructions and copious amounts of pure Inca pottery present in Pachacamac. Colasuyu. Of comparable importance to the Inca Empire was Colasuyu, the region adjacent to Lake Titicaca. While the splendors of the Tiwanaku civilization had long since faded, many tales bear witness to the very close links between Callao and the Inca legendary past. The Valley of Cusco and the Callao Altiplano may tend to be regarded as interdependent regions, and certain sources even suggest that Aymara-speaking principalities supported Pachacutec against the Chancas. Notwithstanding any prior links on a basis of virtual equality between Collas and Incas, Pachacutec in the initial phase of Inca long-range expansion imposed his will on the Collas by force, defeating in battle the lord of Hatun Colla and annexing his kingdom, while Hatun Colla thereafter served as an Inca base complete with a temple to the sun and many storehouses. The main provincial center of this region in Inca times was Chuquito, the capital of the Lupaca chiefdom, situated a little further to the southeast, near the present-day lakeside city of Puno. The administration of the region by the Inca Spanish successors is described in some detail in the official Visita of Garcia Diaz de San Miguel, made in 1567. He describes a population and prosperous kingdom, still ruled as in Inca times by two kings named Gari and Cusi. Colao's famous shrine, Copacabana, situated on a peninsula at the south end of Lake Titicaca, was first occupied by Tupac Inca, who installed carefully chosen Mitame groups to guard the precincts and to supervise the flow of pilgrims. Among other characteristics, the Colas were distinguished by a peculiar form of men's headdress consisting of a tall brimless hat, which narrowed at the top, depicted in an illustration of Huaman Poma. Cola-made male heads were deliberately deformed to conform to the shape of this hat, worn in the entire Lake Titicaca region. To achieve this purpose, braided wool was wrapped around an infant's head for more than a year after birth. In marked contrast to the very high altitudes of the Titicaca region, the lush Bolivian Valley of Cochabamba to the southeast stands at a more temperate level of 2,100 meters, also conquered by Tupac. It became, under his successor, a major imperial bastion. Settled by many Mitames from different provinces, this rich valley was transformed into a veritable breadbasket, providing copious provisions for Inca personnel who served in the southern parts of the empire. Among the more notable surviving sites of the surrounding region are Inca Barcay and Inca Lacta, both of which appear to have combined the dual functions of fortress and place of residence. Nordenskjöld, who investigated the latter site as long ago as 1915, mentions a palace with thick walls, but describes the place mainly as a fortress. In the more distinct marches of empire south of Cochabamba, remains of larger administrative centers are conspicuous by their absence. While many vestiges of Inca occupation of this region have been unearthed in recent years, it seems that when they settled in local towns, they merely adapted them to suit their residential and administrative needs. For instance, nothing in northwest Argentina can be remotely compared with the Inca remains in Tumebamba, Ecuador. Since this southern territory had probably only been consolidated in the reign of the last Inca, the time needed for urban development may have been limited. While the fine Inca stonemasonry is apparently absent in Argentina and Chile, the Argentinian archaeologist Rodolfo Rufino and his colleagues have discovered the remains of a number of forts in southern Bolivia and in northwestern Argentina. It is hard to say to what extent these were frontier posts. Rufino also mentions forts in Chile near the Rio Maule, the probable limit of Inca-controlled territory. Further to the northwest, fairly extensive remains of Inca occupation survive. Hans Niemeyer discovered not only large amounts of Inca shards in the Rio Copiapo Valley, but also ample evidence of Inca mining activities. As we have seen, the Incas encountered fierce resistance in Chile, a remote province that was probably only in the earlier stages of pacification. Imperial infrastructure. Fundamental to the control of an empire was of vast dimensions, embracing such varied and intractable terrain, was infrastructure. In this respect, the crowning Inca achievement was their road network, though its fullest extent will never be known, since some roads have physically disappeared. However, many others are still intact and have been studied in recent times. The Inca Road Project, carried out between 1978 and 1981 under the direction of John Hislop, ranks among the finest achievements in contemporary Andean studies. Some roads fall into special categories, such as those leading to high-altitude sanctuaries, usually well above 5,000 meters. Other roads were built for military purposes. Most, however, serve mainly administrative ends, being used for the transportation of goods. The great coastal highway that crosses the Atacama Desert and connects Cusco with central Chile belongs to this category. It would have had little military importance because water supplies were too scarce. Hislop surveyed a total length of 108 kilometers of the Atacama Desert Road, part of which was still in an excellent state of preservation. It appears to have had an original width of 3 meters. He found in all 32 tampu staging posts and other sites along the roads. Of all Inca roads, the most important was the Cusco-Quito Highland route. Many large Inca centers lie on it, and no road in the empire was consistently as wide. Numerous reports survive since many early Spanish travelers used it, and it is the road most frequently described in historical sources. Any early Spanish visitor to the Andean highlands was likely to travel on this basic highway. The average width, even when crossing agricultural land, is between 4 and 6 meters, but part of it is as much as 14 meters wide. Another important road, often described, is the North Coastal Road connecting the Rio Lambayeque and Moche valleys to which Cieza de Leon devotes several detailed chapters. According to Hislop, this road was part of a network already built by the pre-Inca peoples of the region. Hislop, in addition, identified and described the road between Santiago de Chile and the Rio Aconcagua, situated in the empire's southernmost extreme, so recently conquered. The road builders faced many problems in dealing with vastly different types of terrain. Coastal arteries built on sandy land needed no artificial surface. Those built over rocky ground required construction only when they climbed steep slopes. Many roads passed through agricultural lands. They were lined by sidewalls used, according to the early chroniclers, to protect crops from travelers and animals. The height of these walls was usually 1 to 2 meters, thus forming a real rather than a symbolical barrier. Among the most remarkable features of Inca roadways are the elevated causeways, where the bed is raised 1/2 to 2 meters above the surface of surrounding water. The most remarkable, described by Spanish chroniclers, were situated in the vicinity of Cusco. Another major causeway on the shore of Lake Titicaca leads southwards from the important center of Chucuito for a distance of 5 kilometers, crossing 2 shallow bays of the lake. Part of the causeway has stone sidewalks. Bridges were a key feature of the road system. Many of these were fairly simple structures placed on abutments of stone masonry. But what so impressed the early Spaniards were the suspension bridges with fiber superstructures. These were apparently new to the Europeans, and the first crossings on such swaying devices were made with trepidation. Suspension bridges, such as the Great Bridge over the Rio Apurimac, were able to span considerable distances. They could be made of locally available fibers, but suffered from the disadvantage that they needed constant maintenance. Hislop insists that the hanging bridges of the Incas were much more sophisticated than the few that still exist today. For instance, the sides of one bridge, seen by the conquistador Sancho de la Hoz, were so carefully crafted that even if a horse fell on all fours, it could not tumble off. Sancho points out that this was done to prevent travelers from falling into the river below, since in regions far from the sea, almost no Indians could swim. Integral to the road network were the tampu, the roadside lodging and storage areas at a day's walk apart. Situated at a day's walk apart, One major purpose of the tampu was the safekeeping of arms, clothing, fuel, and foodstuffs essential to the functioning of the empire. In contrast to the more solidly built tampu, it is harder for archaeologists to identify the chasqui posts made of perishable wood and thatch, placed at much shorter intervals than the tampu to serve as the system of relay runners who pass small objects and messages over great distances in a matter of days. Cieza de Leon describes them as small houses, occupied by 2 men drawn from the local population. They were sworn to the strictest secrecy concerning the messages that they bore. In the absence of any form of writing, they perhaps ran the risk of becoming garbled when repeated many times over from one chasqui to another. Imperial Government. Information on Inca imperial rule has traditionally been based mainly on accounts by Spanish chroniclers. However, on such aspects as storage facilities, communications, irrigation works, and agricultural in general, archaeological research now offers an ever-increasing flow of concrete data. Much information on imperial government at regional levels derives from 2 early chronicles, that of Damian de la Bandera on the region of Huamanga, written in 1557, and that of Castro Ortega Morejon on Chincha, written in 1558. Apart from the important details provided by these and other Spanish visitas, Cieza de Leon and Polo de Ondegardo offer much general data on the role of provincial governments in the system of land distribution. Such sources concur that each province of the empire was ruled by a governor chosen from the ranks of the Inca elite. They resided in the main provincial centers, where a temple of the sun god symbolized Inca supremacy. In addition to the temples, Cieza mentions the presence in such places of a strong garrison, together with silversmiths and other artisans, implicitly formed by local Mitsime groups drawn from another region. Periodically, the reigning monarch would visit a province, where he was regaled by his governor with dazzling pomp and ceremony. Cieza adds that he himself came to know a few provincial governors who had continued to exert a certain authority even after the Spanish conquest. Many details of the status of such proconsuls remain unknown. For instance, it is hard to determine whether they possessed lands in the provinces that they ruled. The sources also describe a different class of officials, described as visitors or inspectors, who appeared from time to time and made reports to the central government on specific matters, such as the accuracy of the numerical head count of population provided by the Kipunats. Other inspectors were concerned with the administration of justice or the collection of tribute. A special group of visitors was charged with the care of the Mamaconas, the temple virgins devoted to the cult of the sun. The previous rulers of the lands conquered by the Incas, usually known as Caracas, also played an important role. Such Caracas were of highly disparate standing. The term might include, on the one hand, men who had control over powerful kingdoms, such as those of Callao, which they had ruled since time immemorial, but applied equally to the headman of a small valley, containing 3 or 4 villages. Such disparities arose not only from the size of their domain, but also from profound cultural differences between the Sierra and the coast, between groups of herdsmen in the Altiplano and communities based on irrigated lands at lower altitudes. The Inca ruler, or in effect the Inca state, in theory became the owner not only of all land in a newly conquered province, apart from that set aside for the community as a whole. He also took possession of mines and herds of llamas. The Caraca retained at least the right to labor service from the people of his community and, if in fact not theory, according to reports from Spanish administrators, was also left in control of a portion of his previous lands. Garcilasco, for instance, writes of Caraca land ownership and asserts that in each place the people were under an obligation to cultivate these Caraca holdings. Always anxious to stress the benign nature of Inca rule, the chronicler further states that the poorer people only had the duty to serve the Caraca after they had tilled their own fields. He claims that during the reign of Huayna Capac, an official was put to death because he arranged for the cultivation of the Lord's property before that of a poor widow. The Caracas had certain administrative functions, including the organization of the Mita, the universal labor service that provided the goods and services extracted by the Inca state. In addition, they played a key role in the exchange of gifts basic to the complex Inca rituals of reciprocity. However, while these local chiefs retained certain powers and privileges, Inca control was strict, since the provincial lords, or at least those of the more important members of this elite, were obliged to reside at the Inca's court from the age of 14. This enabled their masters to form a good idea as to which son would be the more apt successor. In many cases, this was not necessarily the eldest. Other limitations were placed on the Caracas. While they were forbidden to put their subjects to death, they could flog them in certain instances. Moreover, they had to obey strict rules of protocol. Only a high-ranking prince had the privilege of making a ceremonial toast to the Inca monarch, to whom he would present his cup after drinking. Their resources, moreover, were certainly curtailed in comparison to their revenues in pre-Inca times, when surplus wealth drained off from the population would have been at their entire disposal. Bonds of empire. Before considering other aspects of Inca rule, the imperial cult needs to be stressed as a means of cementing the Inca domain. This cult, centered on Cusco, served as a model on a reduced scale, not only of the empire, but of the universe, since the empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, was conceived as corresponding with the universe itself. The religious factor served not only as a possible motive for conquest, but also as a means to secure the loyalty of those conquered. The sources stress the widespread imposition of the solar deity Inti, personified by the ruler himself, as the son of the sun. Not only in Cusco, but in provincial centers, with their main temple dedicated to the sun, solar worship came to be the dominant religious force, preeminent in funeral ceremonies and other principal rites. In contrast, the Incas would reportedly take hostage the main idol of a newly conquered province and send it to Cusco, where it was honored with the same rites as in its place of origin. People of that province were brought to Cusco to ensure the correct observance of the cult of their deity, whose effigy was lodged in the capital. Rites of the local deities continued to be celebrated in each region, but the cult of the sun was imposed upon these local religions as a unifying force. Imperial cohesion was also furthered by the overall use of the Quechua language spoken by the Incas, though Aymara was the native tongue of the extensive territory of Callao. The principal elite were expected to know the language of Cusco. The importance of Quechua as a lingua franca was further enhanced by the babel of tongues created by the moving of so many groups of migrants from one corner of the empire to another. These Mitimes were obliged at times to speak Quechua, while also conserving their own true native idiom in their new homes, where some other tongue also prevailed. After the conquest, the Spaniards also furthered the use of Quechua. The viceroy, Francisco de Toledo, convinced that this language would be the best instrument for speaking the gospel, established chairs in Lima University for the teaching of Quechua, in which the catechism was also printed. The Spaniards even reported that in northwest Argentina, some 70 years after the conquest, Quechua was spoken, though elements of Aymara had also spread to that region. The land. As in other pre-industrial societies, for the Incas, land ownership was the symbol of both wealth and status. However, Certain surviving accounts of the landholding system throughout the empire tend to reveal discrepancies between theory and practice. On this rather complex problem, Bernabe Coble gives a useful outline of the data of earlier sources. In conformity with such reports, he asserts that when the Incas first conquered a town or province, they would divide the land into three parts: the first for the state religion, the second for the Inca ruler, and the third for the community as a whole. In many places, the division between church and state was not equal. In some instances, the ruler took the largest share, while in others, the greater part of the land belonged to the cult of the sun and other gods. The Caracas would divide the community holdings among the common people in accordance with the size of each family. If the men were absent on military service, others would till their fields. To some extent, the notion that the Inca state disposed of all lands may be regarded as a legal fiction since, as we have seen, the Caracas also retained certain rights to land, though these are harder to define. In practice, the grant by the Inca ruler of the land to Caracas was perhaps nothing more than a confirmation by the state of certain existing rights, deriving from pre-Inca times. While the Incas thus appropriated many holdings, they not only did much to increase productivity, but also brought extensive additional land into cultivation. Irrigation had existed in Peru for millennia before their time, but both on the coast and in the highlands, archaeological research demonstrates the impressive scale of Inca irrigation works. They not only dammed rivers, but even corrected, or turned, their courses. For instance, at Cajamarca, a canal was cut in the rock for more than 800 meters, and Inca engineers gave it a zigzag course to slow down the flow of water. In the difficult highland terrain, the system of man-made terraces was so extended in Inca times as to give many Andean valleys the appearance of veritable staircases. The banks were held up by walls of stone, the height of which varied with the steepness of the incline. Mines and herds. While the exact proportion of lands which the Inca state expropriated may be open to question, their claim to monopolize the all-important mining rights is more clearly defined. Metallurgy was an ancient craft among the Andean peoples, but the insatiable Inca appetite led to an intensified search for precious metals extended to distant regions. The sources stress outright ownership by the Inca ruler of all mines and herds. Possibly the lure of gold was the main motive for the conquest of far-off Chile, where mines are known to have been exploited by the Inca conquerors. Various Inca mining settlements have also been identified by archaeologists in northwest Argentina, where early Spanish colonial sources refer to Inca mines. Callao was rich in minerals, particularly in the area to the northeast of Lake Titicaca. Not only provincial governors, but also local Caracas in many parts of the empire would make presents of gold and silver to the ruler, which implies that these Caracas also retained an interest in mining activity, if only to enable them to bestow gifts on their sovereign. Various chroniclers attribute to the Inca the direct ownership of the great herds of cameloids. The domestication of the llama and the alpaca endowed the Peruvian community with a unique asset among the peoples of the New World, generally ill-provided with domesticated animals. Originally, cameloids flourished mainly in the very high altitudes of Collasuyu, where the local rulers had traditionally possessed large herds. They were prized for their wool, used to make the luxury textiles needed for religious rites. They also played a role in the complex procedure of offering gifts to the elite of Cusco. The Inca himself consumed on a large scale exquisite textiles made of the wool of cameloids. He seldom wore a garment more than once and would change clothing several times a day. His litter was also covered with the finest material. Many of the special garments reserved for the emperor and his family were woven in the temples by the virgins of the sun. The llama was also important as a beast of burden. An extremely frugal animal, it can go without food or water for several days, but can only carry a load of about 25 kilos for a distance of 15 kilometers per day. It also served in the Inca religion as a major sacrificial offering, white llamas being the preferred victims of the sun. Each morning in Cusco, one llama was sacrificed by cutting its throat, while keeping its head turned towards the sun, to which it was being offered. The animal was then burned on a special brazier. Llamas were offered in Bolivia not only to the sun, but to the local thunder god Ilapa. The Incas, apart from Callao, established herds in many other regions of the Altiplano where none had existed before. Hence, the state herds were very numerous, serving military as well as ceremonial ends. In contrast, the Spanish conquistadors were more interested in the llama as a source of meat. Social engineering. Fundamental to Inca control of the empire was the Midame system, involving mass transfers of populations from one region to another. The Incas sought to indoctrinate newly conquered peoples and to instill them a subservience so absolute that large groups whose loyalty to the Inca system was undoubted, would obey the call to abandon their homeland and migrate to a newly conquered territory. Here, they would preserve their own rights and customs, and at the same time keep a watchful eye on the local inhabitants, thus furthering the process of absorption, whereby they in turn were also converted into loyal subjects. So strict was the Inca method of control, whether in Cusco or elsewhere, that no record survives of any resistance to this form of social engineering, which has even been likened to the moving of pieces on a chessboard. The chronicler Bernardo Cobo describes the system as essential to the subjection of new provinces. The migrants were normally settled in the provincial capitals. Cobo adds that when the ruler subjected a province, he would remove up to 6,000 or 7,000 families and replace them with these mitimes. The policy was vigorously applied, for instance, in distant Ecuador, whose tribes had so fiercely resisted the Incas. In certain regions, large groups of conquered peoples were removed and replaced by settlers from other parts of the empire. In early colonial times, many of the inhabitants of Quito region were either Quechua or Aymara-speaking Indians from Bolivia. Enclaves of southern colonists also served as focal centers of Inca influence in the northern part of Ecuador, where even today some of these imported settlers can be distinguished by the dress and customs of the inhabitants. People from Ecuador, in their turn, were sent to many other provinces, among them the many mitime groups brought by the emperor, Huayna Capac, to the important Inca center of Cochabamba in Bolivia, where people from the Quito region. To Cochabamba, this ruler also transferred groups of silversmiths from coastal Peru, who faced an arduous trek over the Andes to reach their new home. Most mitimes that have been settled in the Lupaca kingdom on the shores of Lake Titicaca, probably at a relatively early date, came from the valley of Cusco, their original homeland. Ciesa de Leon, who identified many such groups in his long journey southwards, divides the mitimes into three categories. The first served basically military ends, having been sent to establish enclaves or in effect garrisons as a protection against savage frontier peoples. Mitime garrisons of this type were also stationed further north along the critical frontier region of the ever-rebellious Bracamoros and Chachapoyas, against whom the later emperors conducted many rather fruitless campaigns. The second category, whose function was social as well as military, consisted of contingents sent when a new territory was organized into provinces. Installed not solely for security reasons, they also helped to further the process of Incaization of the local inhabitants. The third type of mitimes, economic rather than military, were those sent to populate mountain valleys within the empire that were fertile, but that lacked people to till the soil. Labor as tribute. Throughout the empire, at least in theory, the peasant population served the state by providing labor rather than by paying tribute in kind. Mita was the term generally used for this part-time labor service imposed both in the Cusco region and in the provinces. The state's procurement of labor, in addition to the paramount obligation of military service, was not limited to the tilling of the lands of the ruling class. The weaving of textiles and the making of tools were also important. Apart from such tasks, and from the massive demand of military manpower, the need for labor for building temples and palaces, both in Cusco and elsewhere, for road making, for work on fortresses, irrigation and mining projects, as well as for conveying goods and materials from one place to another, assumed formidable proportions. The demand for labor for transportation of goods alone must have been colossal. For instance, the Emperor Huayna Capac ordered that plentiful supplies of timber for making rafts should be carried all the way from the coast of Ecuador to the shore of Lake Titicaca, about 1,500 kilometers distant. A notable aspect of the organization of Mita manpower is the reported use of a decimal system, not only for military but for civil purposes, as a means of appropriating the work required in each area. Many sources concur that the peasants were divided into bodies of 10,000 who would be placed under the control of a leading curaca. These would be in turn divided into 10 contingents of 1,000, and thereafter into groups of 100 or even smaller, each administered by lesser officials. In practice, obvious doubts arise as to just how a village population could be made to conform to such a precise decimal system. Nonetheless, a preference for this numerical arrangement might account for a tendency to adjust the boundaries of communities in order to attain some degree of uniformity. At least some version of a decimal system could be more readily applied to military service. The numbers thus recruited through the Mita are hard to quantify. But given the ever greater distances involved in waging imperial wars, the obligation clearly became increasingly burdensome. The very nature of the Mita suggests that this form of recruitment did not involve full-time military service. Even if this Mita service was the prime obligation of many males, just as the weaving of cloth was the work of females, The soldiers surely had to return to their villages for part of the year, since women and old men could hardly be expected to cultivate not only their own communal holdings, but also the state lands and those of the Caracas. The services rendered by the Mita system were to some extent reinforced by full-time laborers known as Yanaconas or Yanas. Information as to their origins, numbers, and precise status is far from complete. John Murrah, who has written extensively on this subject, states that he simply does not know whether they can be truly described as slaves. The Yanas, who had apparently been torn as individuals from their original houses, were entirely dependent on those for whom they worked, often as domestic servants, bodyguards, or litter bearers. Certain Yanas even attained a privileged status, being given other Yanas as servants, while some also received women as a reward for their zeal in working for their Inca masters. The Spanish chroniclers tend to stress the notion that throughout the empire, the common people contributed to the state and to its elite services rather than goods. But if the obligation of the laborer supposedly took the form of service, what provincial governors in Caracas actually received were the goods that he made, particularly in the case of artisans and other specialists. The cornucopia of luxury articles produced by such craftsmen amazed the Spaniards, who found them both in Cusco and in the provinces. Craig Morris, in his archaeological study of Inca warehousing, describes facilities of enormous size and sophistication. While records of storage for the most part perished with the last interpreters of the Quipunates, the storehouses themselves still dot the hills above the ruins of many Inca towns. A large part of the fine cloth and other goods that conferred status was naturally sent to the capital, where so many of the elite recipients resided. The accumulation of exquisite adornments stored in Cusco, which so astonished the first Spaniards, appeared to have far exceeded even the extravagant needs of the upper social strata. One reason for this accumulation of so much finery in Cusco itself was that if later sent to the other provinces as gifts, these in theory came from Cusco. The prestige of such gifts was enhanced by association with the ruler and its capital. In contrast, ordinary subsistence items were more often taken not to Cusco but to big provincial centers such as Huánuco. Nonetheless, the huge amounts of luxury cloth that the Spaniards saw in Cajamarca were probably the result of the sovereign's temporary presence, rather than a sample of Cajamarca's usual supplies. In the final analysis, the whole system may be viewed as a form of redistribution, but one that ministered more to the comforts of the ruling class than to the needs of their humbler subjects. It must, moreover, be borne in mind that as part of the tributary system, the common people provided not only for the Inca conquerors, but for their own Caracas. As such, the system surely had ancient roots. Trade and barter. While the flow of riches to Cusco and to provincial storehouses was impressive, interchange of merchandise in the form of trade rather than tribute was more restricted. In an empire in which climatic variations were so marked, particularly between the Altiplano and the coast, it might be logical to expect a copious flow of goods from one province to another, managed by well-established merchants. However, the Incas seem to have been strongly averse to the creation of a powerful merchant class and to the creation of a market network in which goods native to different regions might be freely traded. In contrast, they tended to favor a system whereby each region attained a degree of self-sufficiency without too much reliance on its neighbors. Fundamental to the system is what John Murrah has described as the principle of verticality, whereby polities of the Sierra established their own settlements at lower or warmer levels on or near the coast, and also at higher altitudes than their homeland. Such centrally controlled settlements formed part of what Murrah has defined as vertical archipelagos, able to provide produce native to a wide range of ecologies, without recourse to formal trade with other provinces. A striking example of the system is the Lupaca kingdom, documented by the Visita of Garcia Diaz de San Miguel in 1567. And the Lupaca, who lived at an altitude of 3,600 meters in the vicinity of Lake Titicaca, controlled their own settlement on the coast, situated on the present-day border between Chile and Peru, and also others extending as far as Moquegua, some 160 kilometers to the northwest. Hence, they not only were self-sufficient in maize and cotton, but also obtained a whole variety of marine produce. The system was greatly expanded in the final period of Inca rule, and the long-distance operations of the last emperors led to the establishment of settlements up to 60 days' walk from their homeland, suggesting that the vertical archipelago was undergoing fundamental change in the decades immediately before 1532. Murrah's hypothesis ranks as a major contribution to Andean social studies, and he himself has been the first to concede that the system had its limitations. Possibly conditions in certain parts of the Andes favored this approach, whereas elsewhere this was not the case. Certain kingdoms on the shores of Lake Titicaca only established islands towards the Pacific coast, while others made settlements on the edge of the tropical forest on the eastern slopes of the Andes, and had none on the coast. A preference for regional self-sufficiency also served to stimulate the production of the core provinces in order to supply the needs of their inhabitants and to satisfy the tributary demands of the Inca state, both for the capital and for other important centers. In this respect, much was achieved by the Incas' intensive development of irrigation. This drive to increase agricultural production was gaining momentum at the time of the conquest. If the Incas invented few new techniques, their use of established skills achieved impressive results. One may recall Huayna Capac's development of the Cochabamba Valley, involving the introduction of large groups of mitimes. Cieza de Leon, in writing of the mitime system, records that it served to populate barren areas, to such an extent that in Inca times very little usable terrain remained uncultivated. The chronicler sadly remarks that whereas the idolatrous Incas cared so much for their lands, the Christian Spaniards were basically destructive. But while the Incas displayed a marked preference for regional self-sufficiency, such a policy clearly did not lead to an absolute ban on trade and barter, though no evidence survives of the use of any form of currency for this purpose. Some interchange undoubtedly did take place between the empire as a whole and the wilder tribes beyond its boundaries, consisting basically of coca and other tropical products. Cinnamon and coca and other luxuries were shipped northwards to Ecuadorian highland centers. Further to the south, while the Incas seldom thought to conquer warm lands below an altitude of, say, 1,500 meters on the reverse slopes of the Andes, a certain interchange of goods, such as honey and wax, took place together with limited amounts of coca. Particularly in the more recently conquered northern lands, certain forms of trade continued to flourish, both by sea and from palaces further inland towards Amazonia. Spanish accounts of such activities are few. However, the conquistador Samano Cherez records the description given to him by Francisco Pizarro's pilot of a great raft sighted off the coast of Ecuador. It had a large cabin and cotton sails, and carried an impressive cargo composed of merchandise of a strictly ceremonial nature that included not only shells, but luxury textiles, together with gold and silver ornaments. The chronicler Zarate also describes native crafts, and was surprised to see a whole fleet of sailing rafts in the vicinity of the island of Puna. Some, when used by Spaniards, could carry as many as 50 men and 3 horses. Evidence also survives of the activities of merchants who traded the produce of the southern coast of Peru. Maria Rostrovsky cites colonial documents that write of no less than 6,000 merchants who would travel from Chincha coastal region to Cusco and Collao. They also went to Ecuador in search of gold and emeralds. Part of the Pacific shoreline of Ecuador is still known as the Emerald Coast. These merchants devised a kind of local currency in the form of small pieces of copper, and they had established a fixed rate of exchange between the value of a given weight of gold and silver. Regardless of any Inca preference for state systems of interchange, as opposed to private trade, certain tropical or semi-tropical commodities were unquestionably obtained on an ostensibly private basis from beyond the imperial boundaries. Tolerance of any survival of traditional trade and barter in the conquered regions of Ecuador might also be due to the abundance of certain ritual items in the unconquered parts of that region. Supreme importance was attached to the mulu shells, Spondylus pictorum, available in the warmer Ecuadorian waters, but not in the colder sea to the north. Since the Incas did not dominate coastal Ecuador, any state control mechanism could hardly have satisfied their insatiable demand for Spondylus shells for ritual use. These shells were sent not only to the heartland of the empire, but also have now been found as far afield as northwestern Argentina and Chile. An ecological mosaic. The Inca Empire, as described above, formed a mosaic of differing ecologies, languages, and traditions, on which any theoretical model could only be imposed with a certain flexibility. It was almost impossible for the Inca conquerors to apply identical forms of control upon petty highland chiefdoms and upon the large and longest established Aymara principalities of Collao, let alone upon the great kingdom of Timor. If in theory the Inca ruler was the supreme lord, and if he and his gods owned almost everything except the peasants' holdings, in practice many concessions were made to establish interests. Certain local traditions were respected, and when these were so and where these were so deep rooted as, for instance, on the southern coast of Peru, the imprint of Inca culture was more limited than in certain parts of the Altiplano. On the one hand, supreme power in each province was wielded by the Inca governor and orejon of the highest standing. The spiritual symbol of this imperial presence was the temple to Inti, the sun. But also basic to the machinery of government were the curacas, permitted to retain part of their previous wealth and power, though subject to strict Inca control. The common people were also required to devote much of their time to the service of the state, whether to till the fields or to serve in the army, often in arduous campaigns in far-off lands. To satisfy the local Inca preference for self-sufficiency, each region became, in effect, a state within a state, supplying most of its own needs, a name that was reinforced by the settling of large Mitame groups from different regions, both to supplement the local labor force and to ensure its loyalty, and were necessary to provide specialized craftsmen. It may be true, as many authors maintain, that the presence of merchants and of trade were alien to the Inca spirit. But notwithstanding any predilection for state-controlled interchange, a certain flexibility in practice prevailed if one is to accept the reports of the existence of thousands of Chincha traveling merchants. The presence of traders in Ecuador is also evident, and probably would have continued in order to obtain both the greatly prized spondylus shells from the coast and tropical produce from the Amazonic lands beyond the Andes. This concludes Chapter 8.